All right, strap in, everyone, because today we're going deep, deep into the story of H. Holmes, one of America's first and most infamous serial killers. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've heard it all before, right? But trust me on this one. There's always more to uncover. We've got Wikipedia entries, articles, a casual criminalist video, even a podcast script outline, all ready for us to dissect.
Yeah, it feels like we're about to peel back the layers, all those layers of myth and sensationalism around Holmes. Try to get to the truth of the man and the crimes.
Exactly. So let's rewind all the way back to his beginnings. Long before the infamous H. Holmes, there was Herman Webster Mudgett, a seemingly normal childhood in New Hampshire, decent family, even showed an early interest in medicine. Not exactly a red flag, right?
True, true. But even then, there are these hints of something darker, a fascination with death, anatomy. The sources mention him building scarecrows as a kid, this obsession with perpetual motion machines. Maybe it was just curiosity, but, well, some might see it as a sign, an early sign of something. Dot off.
Okay, so that raises a big question right away. Was Holmes born evil? Are there warning signs we can look back on and say, aha, there it is?
It's tempting, isn't it, to connect the dots like that? But it's rarely that straightforward. Even Freud, with his ideas about the death drive, he knew these darker impulses. They're in all of us. It's the mix, right? Nature and nurture, personality, opportunity. The environment shapes who we become. Not every kid who dissects a frog ends up a serial killer.
Right, of course. But things definitely took a turn, a dark turn, when Holmes went to medical school.
That's where the criminal activity really kicks off. We're talking stealing corpses, staging accidents for insurance scams. This isn't just morbid curiosity anymore. It's calculated, manipulative, a total disregard for the law, not to mention human life.
And let's not forget, this was the late 1800s. Ethical standards, especially in medicine, a little looser back then. Holmes was basically exploiting every loophole he could find.
Exactly. The medical schools. They needed cadavers for their students.
Yeah.
Holmes saw a demand, a gruesome demand, and he met it, turning death into profit. A chilling kind of entrepreneurial spirit, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely chilling. So now we've got this morally flexible medical student. What happens next? What's the turning point that leads him to becoming H. Holmes?
Well, 1886 rolls around. Holmes sets his sights on Chicago, a city transforming, growing, and he adopts the name H. Holmes, buys a drugstore in Inglewood, and this is where the legend of the murder castle begins.
Okay, castle makes me think turrets and moats. This wasn't exactly fairy tale material, was it?
Oh, not at all. From the outside, it looked normal enough. 3 stories, shops on the ground floor. Holmes's drugstore right there, lending it an air of respectability. But the upper floors, that's where things got strange.
Secret rooms, hidden passageways, trapdoors, all straight out of a horror movie, right?
It gets worse. Soundproof rooms, gas lines he could control, chutes to the basement. There were even whispers of surgical tables, vats of acid, a true house of horrors designed to carry out and conceal his crimes.
Just picturing being lured in there, not knowing what's coming, gives me chills.
And the psychological impact of that place? On his victims, on Holmes himself.
Oh, absolutely.
For the victims, it must have been terrifying. Isolation, feeling trapped, always wondering what was coming next.
Yeah.
And for Holmes, the castle became, well, a reflection of his mind, a manifestation of his desires. It gave him power, control. It was his stage, and everyone else just players in his deadly game.
Wow, okay, so the stage is set, Murder Castle is up and running, and what's happening in Chicago at this exact same time? The World's Fair? Crowds, excitement, the whole city buzzing.
It was the perfect storm for someone like Holmes,
Yeah, how so?
All those visitors from everywhere, people wanting to see the marvels of the fair, maybe a bit naive, trusting, easy pickings. It gave Holmes anonymity and a constant flow of potential victims. Blending in was child's play for him.
So let's talk victims. There are so many stories, so much mythology. Where do we even start separating fact from fiction?
You're right, we have to be careful. Stick to the evidence. We may never know the full extent of his crimes, but some cases, the details are just too chilling to ignore.
Okay, so let's get specific. Emmeline Segran, she worked for Holmes as a secretary, right?
Exactly, and it's important to remember the social context. Late 19th century, women like Emmeline, they had limited options, especially financially. They were vulnerable. And Holmes, he was a master at exploiting that.
So Emmeline disappears? What happened?
There were rumors, pregnancy, maybe a botched abortion, which obviously Holmes was in no position to handle safely. At the time, her disappearance was brushed aside. But later, when they searched the castle, they found her skeleton, among others.
It's disturbing.
It was almost like he had a system, lure them in, exploit them, dispose of them. A horrifying business model. The unsettling thing is, Holmes seemed to compartmentalize it all. Murder, just another transaction for him, almost devoid of any human emotion.
Okay, so Emmeline Cigrand, one piece of the puzzle. Now, Benjamin Pedet's. This case was tied directly to Holmes's downfall, wasn't it?
It is. This was fascinating because it wasn't just murder. It involved this whole elaborate insurance scam. And Pete itself wasn't just a victim. He was Holmes' accomplice in a bunch of schemes.
Wait, so Holmes wanted to cash in on Pete Saul's life insurance, but instead of faking his death, he actually kills him.
Yeah, that's right. And it gets worse. Holmes doesn't stop there. He goes on to murder 3 of Pete Thill's children, using their trust, their innocence, to further his own agenda.
So that's just unbelievable. To kill your accomplice and then target his kids, what kind of monster does that?
It shows you the depths of his cold-bloodedness, the utter lack of empathy. It's almost impossible to grasp. He saw people as pawns, expendable once they'd served their purpose.
The Pithos case is incredibly dark. Are there any other cases that show this pattern? Holmes preying on people's vulnerabilities?
The Williams sisters, Minnie and Nanny. Minnie was lured in by the promise of a job, which, as we discussed, was a big deal for women then. Holmes used her desperation, just like he did with Emmeline Cigrand.
So he seduces Minnie, convinces her to sign over her property in Texas, and then, poof, she's gone.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, Minnie's younger sister, Nanny, comes to visit, and she disappears too. Holmes erased them both, leaving only a trail of financial transactions.
It's like their lives were stolen, swallowed up by Holmes's greed, his need for control. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of the World's Fair, right? How did that environment contribute to his crimes?
Well, think about it. The World's Fair, it represented progress, innovation, a new era. But it also brought chaos, anonymity, a kind of naivete. People were more willing to trust strangers, take risks. It was the perfect breeding ground for someone like Holmes.
The city itself almost became complicit in his crimes. All the energy, the crowds, the focus on the future, it masked the darkness lurking beneath.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And that's what Holmes was so good at, wasn't he? Hiding his true intentions behind this facade. The charming doctor, the successful businessman.
Precisely.
It was all a carefully constructed act.
And that deception, it allowed him to operate for years, building this web of lies, manipulation. But even the most cunning spider eventually gets caught in its own web. Holmes was no exception.
The crazy thing is, he wasn't caught for murder, at least not at first. It was something much more ordinary.
You mean the stolen horse?
Yeah, the stolen horse.
Almost comical, isn't it?
Totally.
But that one seemingly minor offense, it set up a chain of events, that led to the unraveling of his whole empire of deceit.
It's like a twisted butterfly effect.
Yeah.
A stolen horse flapping its wings in Texas, leading to the collapse of the murder castle in Chicago.
That's a great way to put it.
Before we get to that, though, there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to look at. The botched insurance scheme with Marion Hedgebeth.
Yeah?
The one where Holmes tried to fake his own death.
Right.
It's surprising he didn't pull it off,
Is it?
considering all the other schemes he got away with.
What's interesting about this case is that it might show a shift in Holmes's personality. He was getting reckless, maybe overconfident. And that arrogance, that would ultimately be his undoing. But we'll dive into that more in the next part of our deep dive.
Can't wait. This is getting good.
So we left off with Holmes on the run. Pinkerton's hot on his trail, a stolen horse, and a messy insurance scheme. Things aren't looking so good for our master manipulator.
Right, like watching a train wreck in slow motion. You know it's going to be bad, but you can't look away. So how do they finally catch him? Big dramatic showdown.
You'd think so, wouldn't you, with a guy like Holmes?
Yeah.
But no, it was pretty straightforward. They arrest him in Boston. Of course, he tries to spin it. Confesses to the fraud, paints himself as this charming rogue, denies any involvement in the murders.
Classic Holmes. Minimizing, deflecting, trying to sweet-talk his way out of a murder charge.
You got it.
Murders? Who? Me? Never.
Exactly. And for a while, it almost worked. The authorities, they were focused on the fraud, trying to figure out what happened to the Pittisell family.
But they weren't dealing with some rookie detective. This was Frank Geyer, a Pinkerton agent. A reputation for being thorough, relentless. He wasn't going to let Holmes charm his way out of this, was he?
Not a chance. Geyer was like a dog with a bone. Tracked Holmes's movements across states, even into Canada. Imagine that, in the late 1800s. No internet searches, no databases, just good old-fashioned detective work.
It's like something out of a Sherlock Holmes novel. The detective, the criminal, the race against time.
Exactly, and the stakes were high. Geyer's investigation leads him to a house in Toronto, and in the cellar. He finds the bodies of Alice and Nellie, two of the Pithel children.
Oh, God.
This is the confirmation. Holmes wasn't just a con man. He was a cold-blooded killer.
That's just horrific. So what about Holmes back in jail? Does he crack under pressure? Show any remorse?
Not a bit. He stays defiant, even arrogant. Releases statements through his lawyer, downplaying the accusations, even mocking the investigation. At one point he claims, "You can find bones anywhere and say they're mine." Like he really believed his own lies.
Or maybe he was just that good at playing the victim.
It's incredible, isn't it?
And then he goes and publishes his autobiography, Holmes' Own Story, full of lies and half-truths.
Classic narcissist, trying to control the narrative. Wants to be remembered as a brilliant con man, a victim of circumstance, anything but the monster he was.
All this is happening while the media is going wild, right?
It was a media frenzy.
The public is glued to the story. This devil in disguise, everyone wants to know more.
The murder castle becomes this morbid tourist
But
attraction.
seriously.
People were both horrified and fascinated. Holmes became a biggie man, a symbol of the dark side of progress, the evil hiding beneath civilization's surface.
Wow, a real-life horror story. So the trial begins. What's Holmes' defense? Does he finally admit to the murders?
Nope. Changes his story again. Claims Benjamin Pitesel actually committed suicide, that he was just following Pitessel's instructions to get rid of the body, to help the family collect the insurance.
Still playing the con man, even when facing a murder charge.
Unbelievable.
But this time, the jury didn't buy it.
They saw through the charade. The evidence was overwhelming. The children's bodies, the murder castle, the pattern of deceit. Finally, after years of getting away with it, justice was about to be served.
He's found guilty of Benjamin Pittesel's murder, sentenced to death. How does he react? Any last-minute confessions? Remorse?
None at all. In fact, he tries to profit off his infamy. Offers to confess to more murders for a price. Claims he committed 27 murders. Turns out many of those victims were still alive.
Wow, just when you think he can't get any more manipulative.
Right. It's his ego, that need for control even facing death.
So, the execution. Was it as dramatic as the rest of his story?
Dramatic, yes. But maybe not in the way you'd think. Holmes was calm, almost nonchalant the whole time. He tells the executioner to take his time, he even jokes with his lawyer. It's like he's putting on one last performance.
Still playing the role, to the very end.
The irony is the execution itself was botched. His neck didn't snap cleanly. He ended up slowly strangling to death. His body convulsing for several minutes before finally going still.
God, that's intense. A twisted form of poetic justice, wouldn't you say?
You could say that.
The man who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain and suffering ends up dying a painful, drawn-out death himself.
But even in death, the myth of H.H. Holmes continued to grow. Rumors about the murder castle, his body count. He became a legend.
A real-life boogeyman.
Exactly.
But amidst all the hype, the horror, we have to remember the victims, real people whose lives were cut short because of this man. Emmeline Segrin, the Pitessel family, the Williams sisters, and so many others whose names we'll never know.
You're absolutely right. It's crucial to acknowledge their suffering, honor their memory, remember that behind the headlines, the myth, there were real human lives lost.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Holmes's early life, the murder castle, his capture, the media frenzy, the trial, his execution. But there's still this big question. Why? What would drive a person to commit such horrific acts?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
The big why. And honestly, there's no easy answer. It's like a puzzle with missing pieces. We can speculate, analyze the evidence, try to understand the psychology, but some things will always remain a mystery.
Yeah, I get that. But we've got to try, right? The sources we've got, they have to offer some clues about what made Holmes tick. What are some of the theories out there?
Well, the sources paint a pretty clear picture. Holmes was driven by greed, a need for control, and a complete lack of empathy. He just didn't see other people as human, more like objects, to be used and discarded when he was done with them.
That's the part that's hard to grasp, you know? The lack of empathy. It brings us back to the psychopathy diagnosis, right?
Exactly. Psychopathy is complex. Lack of remorse, disregard for social norms, impulsive and manipulative behavior.
Wow.
Not all psychopaths become violent criminals, but in Holmes's case, those traits combined with his ambition and the opportunities of the time, it was a recipe for disaster.
Right, all these factors coming together in this very specific way to create this Merit-D monster. But there was also this element of performance in his crimes, wasn't there? Almost like he enjoyed the attention, the fear.
You're right, that's important. For Holmes, it wasn't just the money, the power. It was the game itself. He was addicted to the thrill of outsmarting everyone, building this elaborate web of deception
Yeah.
and watching it unfold. The more he got away with, the bolder he became,
Yeah.
the more reckless.
Like a twisted chess master,
Yeah.
moving people around like pawns,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
completely indifferent to their suffering. And this whole time, he's playing a character, right? The suave doctor, the entrepreneur.
Right, he created this persona, allowed him to move through society undetected, gain people's trust, lure them into his web, and it worked for a while. He was a master manipulator, a chameleon, but he got overconfident, and that was his downfall.
Hubris, the downfall of the arrogant. It's a tale as old as time. But over a century later, people are still fascinated by him. Why do you think that is? What is it about H.H. Holmes that keeps us coming back?
I think there are a few reasons. The sheer scale of his crimes, the horror, the mystery surrounding his motives, we may never truly understand what drove him.
It's like trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. And the murder castle itself. There's something both terrifying and fascinating about that place.
Oh, for sure. It's become a symbol of evil, a place where nightmares come true. It taps into our deepest fears, the unknown, being trapped
Right.
at the mercy of someone with bad intentions.
And it all happening during the World's Fair, this time of innovation, progress. It adds another layer to the story.
Absolutely. It's this contrast, the optimism, the progress, and the darkness lurking beneath. Holmes's story, in a way, it represents the shadow side of ambition, the potential for evil to exist alongside good.
Even in the brightest of times, darkness finds a way. A cautionary tale. But beyond the horror, the fascination, there's something to be learned from this case, right?
Definitely. It reminds us that evil can be deceptive. You can wear a mask of charm, intelligence. We need to be careful, trust our instincts, question our assumptions,
Yeah.
especially when things seem too good to be true.
So the takeaway for our listeners, what do you want them to remember about H.H. Holmes?
I want them to remember that even in a world of progress, evil can flourish. Be discerning, trust your gut, and never underestimate the potential for darkness to hide in plain sight.
Well said. And with that, our deep dive into the world of H.H. Holmes comes to an end. But the conversation doesn't have to stop here. We've explored the man, the myth, the motivations, but what about today? Could someone like Holmes exist in our modern world? With all our technology, surveillance, could a modern murder castle go unnoticed? That's something for you, our listeners, to think about. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and maybe double check those locks on your doors on your door.